there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of the past 10 days or so of reading. The first couple of books I'm going to start with are actually ones that I didn't finish. The first of which is Carrie Fisher's The Princess Diarist, which is, in part, her actual diaries from when she was filming the first Star Wars movie, and in part a memoir of the period leading up to that, and I think the final part is going over some of the afterwards. I never made it to the afterwards. The introduction, which talks about her life in 1976, and then the first little bit of the actual diaries were all that I made it through with this. I was listening to the audiobook, and when it comes to a lot of memoirs, I often prefer to listen to the audiobook if it's read by the author. And in this one, the two memoir bits are read by Carrie Fisher, and the middle bit is read by her daughter. I found this incredibly depressing. A lot of Carrie Fisher's writing in general, but also her autobiographical writing, has always struck me as having the right balance between kind of pathos and humor. But this just made me feel incredibly sad for her 19-year-old self. Which is weird to say, because I mean, she was still the daughter of two celebrities and was, as we know, going into this big role. And unlike some of her other memoirs, it's not dealing with specifically drinking and drugs and mental illness and all of that. But I just found this to be incredibly depressing. Just didn't want to listen to it anymore. Get even more depressing, the other book that I haven't finished yet is They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Lowery. The subheading is The Story of Black Lives Matter. Wesley Lowery is one of the journalists who was famously arrested during the Ferguson protests. He also goes to a number of other places and looks at similar protests and how they arose at the grassroots level. He also reflects a bit on some of his own journalism. He was known for doing Twitter reporting, and he's very open about how his editors wanted him to be very unbiased and very just the facts, and how he sometimes inserted emotion into even just these short tweets. Well, that was very engaging. I had a hard time engaging with the book overall, which was strange because I wanted to know more about this, and he was definitely in a unique position being a journalist on the scene for it, but I just couldn't connect with it, and I think maybe the problem is that this was the book that I was trying to read on my phone. I'd had the ebook out of the library, and it actually expired on me, and I was going to give up on it, and I've actually taken it out again, and I'm thinking I'm going to try reading it on my tablet, because I think maybe it was just, this was not conducive to reading on the phone. Some books that I did get to. The first one was Language of the Thorns, Midnight Tales and Dangerous Magic by Leigh Bardugo. I know Leigh Bardugo is one of those golden writers for the YA side of BookTube. I've been on the fence. I really love the universe she's built, and I think the magic building and the cultures that she's created are really fascinating. And I thought Six of Crows was a lot of fun, but I really hated the main plots of the Grisha trilogy. So I originally was actually not going to pick this up, but then I saw a review that pointed out that the idea behind this is that this is a series of stories that are basically fairy tales that would have been told to the characters in those other series that she's written, which makes it sound like this is pure world building. And since the world building was absolutely my favorite part of what she created in those two series, I definitely wanted to pick this up. And I was not disappointed. These were a great deal of fun. I think if you're actually looking for typical modern fantasy story, this might not be what you're looking for, because these are very much in the form of fairy tales, and they are illustrated really nicely in the style of the kind of fairy tale book that you'd give to kids to read. So it looks like a children's fairy tale storybook. I loved that. I thought it was charming, the packaging is great, and it definitely does a lot of world building, which was fantastic. After that, I went back into the land of celebrity memoirs, and I read Bruce Springsteen's memoir, Born to Run. This is actually surprisingly long for a celebrity memoir, and I did read this instead of listening to it, which is my usual thing for those. I'm not a huge fan of Bruce Springsteen's music particularly, but I do really admire him as a songwriter, and I'd known a couple of people who read this who were kind of similar to me, not particularly fans, but said this was a really interesting memoir. So I thought, okay, I will give it a read. And the first half of it actually was quite interesting. I think there are a few points where I thought it needed an editor. There's one story in particular where he talks about traveling to California, where his parents and his youngest sister have moved. And there's a kind of a lengthy story about his youngest sister baking a cake, and I felt like there was no reason that that baking a cake story needed to be in here. I felt like there must have been an editor who didn't want to correct him and cut some of that out. So it's definitely longer than it needs to be. But the first half is a really interesting portrait of working class New Jersey childhood. It reminded me a lot of the childhood descriptions in Ron Kovic's Born on the 4th of July, which actually in the middle of the book Bruce Springsteen talks about because he knows Ron Kovic, and I guess Born in the USA was based somewhat on his story. So I thought it was interesting that it had, up until that point, it had been reminding me, both in terms of content and style, of that. So that they knew each other and that he'd taken inspiration from Kovic I thought was really interesting. So the childhood part and then the build-up and the work that goes into becoming a musician was all fascinating. So I was really engaged with all of that. This was definitely one of those books that I wasn't expecting to enjoy that much. And then I would think I'm going to read a chapter, before bed, and suddenly it's midnight and a couple of hours have passed. Once he becomes famous and we get down to, and then he met Mick Jagger, and then he was inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and then they bought ponies. I wasn't super interested in most of that. That said, I think if you were a huge fan of Bruce Springsteen, you might enjoy a lot of that a lot more than I did. The bits that were how the music industry worked and how building the career worked, and then the kind of working class New Jersey childhood elements, that was all great. The post-celebrity stuff was not for me, but I think a lot of other people might enjoy that. So after that, I turned to some fluff, and I read Justice League of America Road to Rebirth. This is a collection of the comics that introduced the new sort of younger members of the JLA. This was primarily written by Steve Orlando, but a few of the character books have a co-writer. As this Road to Rebirth title suggests, this does lead into the new Rebirth title. I was reasonably entertained. I have really enjoyed Steve Orlando's writing on the Midnighter and then Midnighter and Apollo comics, so I wanted to see what he was doing on some of these more flagship DC titles. I'm not entertained as much by this, but then it is a more traditional style superhero comic, which is less my thing than some of these more peripheral books where I think they can do a little bit more experimentation because it is more peripheral, but still I found this reasonably entertaining. After that, I read Hyperbole and a Half by Allie Brosh. I think a lot of people are familiar with this just from that one image of clean all the things of her paint characters, because I think that went fairly viral. This is a collection of a number of the stories that have appeared on her blog, plus a few other ones. There were a number of these in here where I remember having thought that they were incredibly funny when I first read them online a few years ago, and when I read them now, they weren't quite as magical to me. And with a lot of it, I was almost conflicted. I thought, am I supposed to be laughing at this, or am I supposed to sit back and say, my God, this woman needs help? I don't know. So it was weird because I was very enthusiastic to read this because I'd had this memory of she's really funny. And I didn't feel like it was as funny as I remembered it even when they were the same stories. It's also kind of a weird contrast in that some of it is intentionally serious material, like the stories about her issues with depression that have appeared on her blog as well are in here. But they're in there interspersed with wacky stories about her dogs behaving badly, which is a bit of a weird contrast, which exists on the blog, but in the blog you might read one and then read the next one a few months later when she posted it, whereas reading them back to back in this made it feel a little bit strange. Still very entertaining, and the things that she can convey with these very simple paint style drawings is really impressive. So after that, I read How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents by Julia Alvarez. This is a backwards moving family story about these four sisters who immigrate to the US from the Dominican Republic in reverse. At the beginning of the book, we meet them as adults. Each chapter has one sister as a focus, although a lot of them aren't actually narrated by the sister. And it's interesting because as they go backwards, I felt like there was less of a connection between the younger selves and the older ones, but it almost didn't matter because instead of being four independent characters, it was almost like the family was a character on its own. So I wasn't bothered by that, and I quite enjoyed this. As they get younger and younger, and the stories are back in the Dominican, it was actually really interesting because a lot of it was dealing with political unrest through the eyes of really young children, which is one of those things that I really enjoy when it's done well, and I did think this did that really well. So I was very enthused. There is a not quite sequel, but a book that focuses on one of the sisters called Yo, which I have now taken out of the library because I just want to read more about these people. Yeah, so I was super enthused, and I really liked the way the structure of this worked, because I think that could be a hard thing to do well, but this definitely added something extra to it that if it were flowing in a more linear way, I don't think would have come across in the same way. And after that, I read something that I didn't think I would ever read, which was Timothy Ferriss's The 4-Hour Body. I had been talking to a friend of mine who mentioned this, and I kind of made fun of him because he's not heavy, and I said, you know, are you trying to lose weight? And he said, no, you're wrong. It's not a weight loss book. It's about this guy doing crazy things. And that's a fairly vague description, but I was curious enough that I took the ebook out of the library. And it is indeed about this guy doing crazy things. It is in part a self-help book, but in the first chapters, the author actually says, this is not a book for you to read straight through if you are looking to improve your baseball game. Read chapter X. If you're looking to lose 20 pounds, read chapter Y. If you're looking to live longer, read, you know, such and such chapter. So he talks about it in terms of if you were reading this as a self-help book, don't read the whole book. But if you do read the whole book, what you get is this journey of self-experimentation where the author goes through a ridiculous number of unnecessary medical procedures just to see how his own body deals with different types of exercise and drugs and supplements and eating styles and all kinds of somewhat crazy seeming things, which I thought was really fascinating. So for me, I thought it worked almost better as a memoir/pop science book than it did as a self-help book. Because a lot of the stuff in here I don't think anyone is actually going to do. There are some guides in here where I did think, okay, that would be useful if somebody wanted to improve their swimming technique, for example. But on the other hand, instead of reading the one chapter about swimming, I think there are a lot of resources specifically about swimming that would do better. Similarly on the weightlifting and the body recomposition and so on and so forth. So I do think the main reason to read this is to listen to this guy talk about the things he managed to do to his body. Much more entertaining than I thought it was going to be based on when I was making fun of my friend for reading that. Have you had experiences of reading something that was clearly meant to be published in one genre, but it actually fit into something else like that? Because, yeah, it was unexpected. Anyway, that's been my week and a half of reading, which was pretty decent. I hope yours was good as well. That's it for now. Ciao.